Good morning to you, Herman. Thank you so much for coming and accepting my invitation to talk today. As you know, I've been bridging the gap between UK-China business since 2001. And indeed, in 2002, both you and I were part of the delegation to the first UK-China Tech Forum in Beijing, where we also had Lord Sainsbury at the time, who's a minister for the government, science minister, as well as Sir Robin Sasby. So since then, UK-China relations has evolved, has experienced lots of up and downs. And but now it has become a lot more complex to do business in China, particularly for tech companies to navigate government policies. So I would really appreciate your personal insight on this topic today, as you have been championing the UK tech sector, the community, for decades.
Yes, indeed, and thank you for having me.
So to start with, in the recent BBC Newsnight program, you have mentioned the law of unintended consequences, saying that the UK's China policy, especially the ones regarding semiconductors, will actually achieve the opposite of what is intended. So could you please elaborate a little bit more on that? Of course, we're not just talking about semiconductors today.
Yes. Well, of course, the UK's policy follows the American policy very closely because America has big influence on the UK policy. So the main result is really derived from America's very aggressive stance in semiconductors, especially vis-a-vis companies like Huawei and ZTE. But extending to really any company that is trying to build state-of-the-art semiconductors in China, because America is very worried about the dual use of the world's most advanced semiconductors, especially 5 nanometers and below, for military purposes. The curious situation that we're in the semiconductor industry is that America doesn't have this technology either. So there are only 2 companies in the world, and that's TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in Korea, that are capable of building semiconductor products at 5 nanometer dimensions and below. So America then looked at other choke points that exist in the industry. In this particular case, the duopoly that America has on the design tools for semiconductor chips by 2 companies, Synopsys and Cadence, that have a 90% worldwide market share in chip design. And they then argued that anybody who uses that technology to produce chips, which are included TSMC, which supplies China with top technology chips, will also fall under the American export regulations. This is an unusually aggressive stance, which worked. So TSMC must follow the American export rules. The unintended consequences is that because this American policy, supported by the UK, but really the UK is not a very large player in semiconductors, has the unintended consequences of forcing China to develop its own technology and its own software. In fact, its entire semiconductor stack. So now there is an opportunity for the West to still do a deal with China on these advanced technologies and get something in return, like the Chinese building advanced semiconductor companies in Europe or in the US. The same argument is also due due for Europe's policy, which is less aggressive than the American ones, but basically is similar to the American ones. So the unintended consequence is that we are forcing China to develop its own complete stack, not just the semiconductor chips, but all the design software, etc. So the question is, can China do it? And there are really two criteria that have always been the key in the semiconductor industry, which gave rise to the titans of the semiconductor industry in Korea, in Taiwan. And that is, does China have the money? Well, the US is spending 50 billion on its CHIPS Act to bring, because Intel has stumbled and Intel can no longer produce the state-of-the-art chips, to bring some of the technology back into the United States of America. Europe has a $50 billion initiative to bring, Europe has about a 10% market share, and it wants to bring it up to 20%, which is where Europe was a few decades ago. And also Britain now has a semiconductor initiative. The government is spending 1 billion. So, you know, when we're talking about Britain punching above its weight, this is probably true, but you've got to look at Britain's weight. And Britain's weight is the weight of a mouse in a herd of elephants. So, you know, if Britain spends 1 billion and the US is spending 50 billion and Europe is spending 50 billion, and TSMC alone, a single company, is spending 100 billion, but now you've got to compare it with China. China is spending 250 billion. So it is spending more than all the others taken together. So when it comes to the actual amount of money that is important in the semiconductor industry, there is no contest. China is outspending everybody else. So then you've got to look at the quality of the and number of engineers. So you've got to ask the question, does China have the educational system? Does it bring to bear enough engineers that are competent in the semiconductor industry? And again, you get the same answer, that China is producing more and can deploy more engineers to this problem than Europe and the US taken together. And they work harder. So in the long term, there is no question in my mind that China is going to win this race. So, but it wouldn't have done so. As you know, there is now this national effort. It's a very rare initiative in China that all of China has a national initiative in semiconductors. So we're basically forcing China to become a competitor that is going to beat us in the long term. So that's what I meant by the law of unintended consequences.
Yes, indeed, China has so much money as a country, you know, and put the investment in, and it produces millions of engineers each year. So some of them are really good. So is this just a matter of time, do you think, for China to catch up and have its own semiconductor? And also, what about this global supply chain, which is also very important for semiconductor? Can China develop all this on its own if the whole Western world decided to block it still?
Well, I'm just writing a book on technology sovereignty. And originally, my idea was a very positive view of Europe, where I would argue that there are only 3 technology sovereignty circles. I'm writing this book together with Hazem Naqib, who is an expert on banking and government relationships. And we came to the conclusion that there are these 3 technology sovereignty circles that have a chance to be sovereign, and that's the US, China, and Europe. And the main argument of the book was going to be that if third countries have to join, like Britain, have to join one of these 3 technology sovereignty circles in order to get a semblance of their own sovereignty, then Europe is the best choice because it's the only one of the three that's not a hegemon. Because if you join America, they will ask, "Are you with me or are you against me?" And if you say, "Well, no, I'm with you," then they say, "Oh, that's great, and I do exactly how I say." In China is pretty much the same with the Belt and Road Initiative. They want to be in charge. Europe is the only area, because of its history, that has a history of being accommodating of national differences. Despite Brexit, which was very sad, it obviously did not manage to accommodate Britain, although, I think this is turning out to be a mistake for Britain. It has managed to accommodate the differences between Germany and France, for example. Who would have thought that Germany and France would ever be willing to share a governance layer above the nation state, which has resulted in the second most important currency in the world, the euro, and has preserved peace since the Second World War. So I'm a passionate European, and I think Europe has been a phenomenal success story. However, when we did the research on the chance of America, China, and Europe becoming technologically sovereign, we realized there is no possibility of even any of the three becoming technologically sovereign because of the hyperconnectivity that we now have in a globalized world. This, of course, is particularly pertinent for Britain because the only way Britain can get anywhere near sovereignty in the sense that they have some say about their own future in semiconductors is by working very closely with Europe in particular. And that's why I've said a number of times that Brexit, at least as far as semiconductors is concerned, was the biggest loss of British sovereignty since 1066, because as part of Europe, it has a say about the development of the European semiconductor industry. Now it doesn't, and therefore it's a loss of sovereignty rather than a gain of sovereignty, as the government would have us believe. So the right solution, the right way to think about the future of the semiconductor industry in particular, is to accept this interdependence that we all have on each other, but make sure that these dependencies are not singular, so that we do not become dependent on a single country that then has the possibility of coercing us economically by withholding either the latest technology or the software or whatever. And that really must be our policy in Europe and the policy of the UK, which is, of course, complicated by the Brexit idiocy.
Just now, you mentioned that the right strategy is to negotiate with China.
Yes.
And while we still have something to negotiate. So what do you think are the negotiables and what are the non-negotiables, considering the UK's position?
Yes. Well, the important thing, I think, is, and the positive way of thinking about this is that America's and European stance with respect to the Chinese semiconductor industry is a shot across the bow, is to make clear to China that some of the Chinese aggressive behavior on part of China is not acceptable to the West. And the West will not allow these subsidies that clearly were the case with companies like Huawei and CTA to distort international markets. So, there are always two sides to a story. So, but China and Huawei in particular clearly are suffering from these sanctions at the moment and the entity list. So I think China is taking this very seriously. So my hope is that this was a shot across the bow to make clear to China that China also, needs to negotiate, and I hope it's not too late. So whenever you negotiate, you've got to have not just the short-term consequences of your policy in mind, which sometimes is the problem with politicians, because they only look as far ahead as the next election, and this will play out over probably a decade or so. I don't think it will be longer than a decade. So people have to look, at least a decade ahead. And if they look a decade ahead, the West has got to have a realistic understanding of where China could be in a decade, how much we could accelerate the rise of China by negotiating a state-of-the-art technology with them, bringing them up faster, as indeed the West has done with Korea when it built up its semiconductor industry, Taiwan, and also Japan. So this has worked very well for the West, because we had an international supply chain which benefited everybody, of lower cost production, more choice of the different suppliers. So if we bring China on as one of the high quality suppliers of semiconductor industry, this will benefit the world. Clearly, the West wants something in return. And the thing that has happened with, say, the Japanese car industry, which was really, Europe and America was very worried about the Japanese car industry. And the solution was for the Japanese companies to build factories in Europe and in the United States, employ European people, and therefore, diminish the trade deficits, and also integrate the economies more. So we now have really quite a happy relationship with Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And I think we need to do exactly the same thing with China.
Yes, indeed. I actually visited China recently, and I understand there's a lot more interest from Chinese companies to set up shops, even manufacturers in Europe. But currently, well, mainly probably in Central and East Europe will be consideration. I guess in Western Europe, because the cost probably be still prohibiting for them. But if, as you say, we think ahead a decade's time, then negotiation can start soon, and that would be a really nice scenario, as you outlined.
Well, this is my hope. And indeed, there are some early signs of America changing its stance, because the latest Biden interview showed that Biden wants to change the word decoupling by the word de-risking. And what he realized, and what the policy wonks in Washington realized, and I hope number 10 is aware of that, is they have realized that there is no way of getting rid of the globalized supply chain. This is going to stay, bar a World War III, which, God, I hope won't happen. And there is an issue with Taiwan, of course. But bar any really catastrophic development, this hyperconnectivity, this supply chain, which is basically based on Adam Smith's division of labor. The reason why we don't produce our own shoes is that it makes sense to have a cobbler to produce the shoes for us. So, this division of labor is a very fundamental building block of our economic setup. So, and this is something that Biden has articulated in his latest speech. He's moved away from decoupling with China to de-risking. What does de-risking mean? De-risking means exactly what I said earlier, that we have to have a supply chain with multiple choices of suppliers at each level of the semiconductor stack, so that we do not become dependent on a single country that then can use this as a choke point, as a dependency to coerce other countries to do what they want to do. And this, sadly, is also true for the US, of course, in the semiconductor EDA tools. But it is true for Taiwan at the moment, most importantly, because they produce 70% of the 5 nanometer chips in the world, and therefore a takeover by China of Taiwan would give China the opportunity to hold the rest of the world to ransom on 5 nanometer chip and below chips. So these are big stakes.
Yes, indeed. So we have seen that recently Macron visited China, and which resulted in a lot of business wins for French businesses. And the UK Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, last Monday also said for the first time clearly that UK has to directly engage with China. But of course, this is at the moment is still very general. So, and you are a world famous serial entrepreneur with a lot of companies right at the forefront of the world innovation, not just in the UK but worldwide. So, in your experience, what is your concerns for the business, tech business, particularly in China? And would you still advise the tech businesses to look at China now?
Yes, of course. China is the biggest market in the world for technology products. I mean, this is not just true for UK products or European products, but also American products. China is Apple's largest market outside the United States. The same thing is true for the German car industry. And of course, all the big countries, when they're talking about decoupling, you then actually have to look at what they actually do. One famous thing about the relationship between children and parents is don't do what parents tell you to do. Do what parents do themselves. That's the only way you can educate children. In this particular case, you've got to look at American rhetoric and what America actually does. So since the decoupling of America started, the trade with China has increased by 20%. So there is a lot of hypocrisy on behalf of the politicians when it comes to the actual realpolitik of dealing with the largest market in the world. So the right policy, again, is one of engagement, on one of making sure that we have the relationship with the largest consumer market in the world and get a trading relationship which is fair for both parties. And that's what the European Union is trying to do. Of course, Macron's visit and Ursula von der Leyen's visit just underline that Europe accepts that we have to have an ongoing relationship with China, but it has to be on a fair basis.
And on that, I would say the UK is not doing as well as Europe, including France, in that direct engagement with China. So far, we have not seen very senior level direct dialogue or visits between the UK and China, but hopefully this year we are going to see that.
It's one of those pendulum stories. We had this golden era during the Cameron period where the Chinese could do no wrong, and anything to do with China was described in the most positive terms. That this is the new way of creating a lot of wealth, importing lots of low-cost products from China, increasing therefore the quality of life and our own living standards by outsourcing. Then they realized that, well, if we outsource too much, we can become too dependent on the Chinese manufacturing machine. And now the pendulum has swung the other way, that people feel China can't do anything right. We've got to stop anything to do with Chinese. And clearly both policies are wrong. We've got to have a very rational relationship with China. China is not going to go away. China has the largest market in the world that we have. If you want to be a successful company, you've got a successful global company, and most technology companies are now global from the start. You've got to have a representation and a sales organization in China. There's just no way around it.
I totally agree. I think 10 years ago, I would say to a startup company or scale-up company to say, you don't need to worry about China. In the first couple of years, you get your home market or other markets, because China is just too difficult, and also it takes a lot more time for you to get there. But now I actually would think all entrepreneurs, startups can look at China from day one, as you say, because China can sometimes help them scale up much faster with the market and also with the funding. So I'd like to just touch a little bit on your own portfolio companies. I mean, Amadeus Capital invested in many deep tech company, and I understand some of them are doing business in China. What are the sort of concerns or issues or lessons learned you would like to share with our audience?
Yes, all deep tech companies have to have a relationship with China, just because of the size of the market. And China is um, the worries that people have had about IP and theft, which, some of this, of course, was true in the past, but we must not forget that the same thing was true for Japan when it grew up, and Korea and Taiwan. So there are things like that, but we also must acknowledge that Huawei, for example, is now the by far the most advanced supplier of 5G equipment in the world. So if they are far ahead of everybody else, and this is acknowledged in the 5G industry, you've got to ask the question who they stole it from. so, so I think this there's also more legal support in China now to protect IP, because there's a lot of IP that is being generated in China itself. It's nowhere near as good as in the West, yes. So China still has to develop its court system to make foreign companies comfortable that their IP is protected and can be defended in Chinese courts. But the direction of movement is in the right direction.
I'm very encouraged to hear you saying that. That's also my own experience as well, because I've been working with many tech companies in Cambridge and the UK, and some parts of Europe like Finland and Belgium. And in fact, most of our clients are doing well in China, or looking positive prospect in the coming years. But I wanted to actually now talk specifically about smaller companies, because it's much harder for them to protect their inventions in China due to the cost of filing and maintaining patents. So I am developing a new concept, a partnership model, where the Chinese IP protection, specifically patent protection, prosecution, could be democratized for smaller tech companies through a long-term relationship with a reputable Chinese IP group. And then that way, the cost of filing patents as well as maintaining them will be covered or reduced. In the meantime, we will use an active, systematic approach to push the technology to the Chinese business sectors, as well as encourage, for example, Chinese entrepreneurs to take up the patents and startup business. I'm still developing the mechanics and talking to entrepreneurs and even university TTOs. But I would like to ask you for your also feedback and what you think the sound of it, and what advice you give it to me and my company Crayfish. As you know, we help tech business to do better, to achieve success in China.
Yes, well, I think this is a very good idea. It's China, of course, is still a difficult market to break into. There is still a large language barrier, because not all the Chinese speak English, although they're being educated at school very efficiently now. And the issue of protecting IP in China is a big issue. And if you can help with that, I think that is very welcome.
Yes, not just protecting them, but more importantly, the model is aiming to help them license the technology better or more quickly. For example, by pushing them to making more, how do I say, the technology end users, i.e. the companies, to be more aware of this. So because there's a lot of IP attorneys who can help them file the patents, but what I'm looking at is to share the risk and return to do that. Great. Thank you so much, Hermann. I think we've covered most of the questions. And thank you again for coming to talk to me today. And I hope I hope I get a chance to catch up with you when you're next in Cambridge.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to that. It's been a pleasure talking to you.